All right, let's get kicked off. Again, hello, welcome everybody to Phosphorus Live. This is our bi-weekly look at the very interesting world of IoT. I am your host, Mike Huckaby. I'm the VP of Technical Go-to-Market here at Phosphorus, and I'm joined today by our Senior Sales Engineer, James McCarthy, who will help us through the conversation. Now, we're happy to have you join us. And to do this every 2 weeks. So the purpose of this bi-weekly webcast is to provide some education on the connected devices that we all use to run our businesses on these days, and to give some insights into the security concerns of those devices, as well as how Phosphorus may be able to help manage those security concerns. The format, we're going to have a quick discussion around a topic, and then we will turn around and have a little bit of a demo of how Phosphorus relates to that topic as well. So again, thank you very much. As we go through this, at the end, we will have a Q&A session. We're recording the main portion of this. At the end, we will turn off the recording and open it up for anybody to be able to ask any questions. If you'd like to be able to ask anything through the Q&A through the chat, you're welcome to do so as well. So today, let me bring up my PowerPoint here real quickly. And today, our topic is living in the data center. Now, I was thinking, for some reason, I was listening to the song "Living on a Prayer," and then I thought, okay, well, maybe living in a data center, maybe that is my prayer or something. And so I decided to pop that in. But it's all about talking about this world of data centers. And a number of years ago, I presented at the SuperNap. This is a picture of that stage and area that I presented. You guys hear about this? Do you know what SuperNap is? Have you heard of it before? It's basically a switch data center that's outside of Las Vegas in the middle of the desert. And it's a bit, as you can tell, a bit futuristic in the way it looked. If you put it up here, the new Fort Knox in the desert. And I remember walking through a tour of the site before I did my presentation, and I was so impressed with the effort to make this massive complex as efficient as possible, from geothermal energy to advanced cooling systems right there in the middle of the desert. So it was really, really amazing. The concentration at the time while I was there, it was all about how do I make this facility efficient. And although security was a consideration, can't say it was a primary concern as I walked around and looked at it. And of course, they had door controllers and access controls. Of course, disaster recovery was a big major focus. But at the same time, the proliferation of the connected data center, I would say, was just starting. So fast forward many, many years later to today. And today, that data center technology kind of continues to evolve. And XIoT devices become really way more prevalent in data centers. Now, remember, XIoT to us is all things connected devices, pieces of firmware that run a device, headless devices, things that can't take agents, all those things that might be embedded inside of an environment, OT, IoT, medical devices, and on and on and on. Now, there's a lot of business that gets run through these data centers. And whether you are a data center provider or that you run a data center for your company, or you contract out to a third party or out to a cloud, every day the connected tech is being used to superpower the data centers. But what this kind of comes concerns. So the key technologies that are being used, at first, we just wanted to make sure that those servers that had our applications and had our data were secure and were running all the time, that it always was available. But there are so many now little issues that come in. And here's a key one that came out this last summer. So CISA last summer presented this guidance around implementation, this guidance for mitigating the risk from internet exposed management interfaces. So what does this mean? The directive required the federal civilian executive branch agencies to take steps to reduce their attack surface created by insecure or misconfigured management interfaces across a number of devices. They are mandating that it works for that group of agencies, but then had strong recommendation for all organizations, both federal and not, to adopt this process. And one of the things that they pulled out very, very quickly was these devices, like routers and switches, need to make sure that they're configured correctly. And they specifically called out these management interfaces, like ILO and iDRAC type of systems. So it's very, very interesting to us because iDRACs typically get installed and they have their default credentials, never get changed. And it's a huge security concern. So all of these interfaces that we're putting into place so that we can remotely manage all of our key critical data, the passwords are default and you can Google them on the internet. So this is a huge concern in data centers, whether it's your own or whether you contract with somebody else to be able to do it. And so it's something to be concerned with. But the guidance here is clear. It's these types of interfaces have to be thought about. Before, it was all about convenience and efficiency. And now these devices have to be looked at for the security concerns that they can provide. And this other piece of detail that I wanted to bring up as well in the data center, 35% of data center UPS devices are vulnerable to attacks because they have insecure passwords and they have things that are unopened, and they all carry so many CVEs with vulnerabilities related to the firmware that they have on those devices. For so long, we just haven't looked at it. We haven't paid attention to it. We put things into place, and quite often in some of that data centers, like the SuperNAP that I went to, they've had UPS systems that have been running for 15 years and never being updated. So the question becomes, whoa, what are the devices that we really need to be paying attention to? So this is a smattering of things across the board that you might see in a data center, from the racks in the middle and UPSs that are there to make sure we have battery backups, to the KVMs that are installed. And those KVMs get installed again so often with default credentials and are never updated and never touched. And I'm sure you all have all been in data centers yourself, looking and pulling one of those out that has probably been used for the last 20 years inside that data center. Everything is connected, and the power with the PDUs that are there on every single rack are a huge concern. So often we're looking at disaster recovery at a large viewpoint, but a single PDU can have multiple CVEs, allowing for remote takeover into those devices, and the power distribution can be drastically changed, which means that all of the power going to a rack could be removed or could be changed so that some of the devices that are either not getting enough power, getting too much power, may act differently. So it's a huge concern in those, because what we're doing is we're installing and not thinking about it and never updating them. I have a couple of other things that are in here. One of the things that's so interesting is just overall access control in data centers, using the access vestibules, being able to go through, or man traps, being able to go through and make sure that you know who the people are that are coming in, and cameras that might be watching people that are inside of it. Well, sometimes cameras not only have default credentials as well as out-of-date firmware. However, there may be settings on there that when you get an advanced adversary that may be able to take hold inside of there, changing settings on the camera that don't allow the people viewing the data center to be able to see what they need to be able to see. So we know that there's concerns around the different types of devices that they have. By the way, that's an iDRAC up in the top left corner. These devices need to be paid attention to, but not only for the devices that you own or that the data centers that you own, or if you are a provider of the data center, making sure that you're doing the right things, but also, are we all asking the questions? The users of the data centers, all of us that are putting data and applications, are we asking these key questions about the infrastructure? Quite often we ask, do you have redundant power, or do you make sure that the doors are locked so nobody can get in there? But are you patching your UPS? And what consistency are you doing that? Are you managing the passwords on PDUs, and what consistency are you using to do that? So I like to say, we got to keep it secure. And if we're not the ones keeping it secure, we got to ask the people who need to make it secure. So I wanted to give that just a little bit of a brief oversight of some of the issues within the data centers. And now I want to hand it over to our sales engineer, James, to be able to give us his perspective on that, utilizing what we might be able to see within the Phosphorus interface. James? And
awesome. Yeah, I'm on mute now. They're unmuted. Thank you, Huck. And Mike, I appreciate that. So yeah, you made a couple points that I wanted to just double click on real quickly here. My background was, in engineering and network engineering specifically. And for the early parts of my career, a lot of my job was migrating on-premise infrastructure to a shared hosted environment. And a lot of my customers at the time, they did a really good job of asking, like you said, the questions about, how are you, kind of securing the physical access to the building, right? Are you ISO certified? Do you have, disaster recovery plans? They had all these questions, but no one ever really asked the questions of, how are you actually updating, the IoT that's in that building? Are you actually maintaining those cameras and those devices? And I think that's something we're starting to see a shift in, the kind of the maturity of our customers, where they are starting to ask those questions, and hopefully more and more, because of the security risk that those things represent, right? We know that, having access to the server through an ILO or an iDRAC card is a pretty big risk. It is the keys to the kingdom. So I want to show real quickly here through the UI. Go ahead and share out my screen. So some interesting views and some things that we can do around the world of PDUs, right? We know that the iDRAC and ILO use case is pretty straightforward. We understand that these things are connected to a server, and they have literal physical access to the machine and can do pretty much anything they want. But with a PDU, I think it's a little trickier. It's a little sneakier, because while they are on the network, and we always think of them as just a battery or just a simple power delivery mechanism, they are actually intelligent. Not only do they have an IP address, but a lot of times these PDUs are connected to the server infrastructure in a logical way as well, not just from a power standpoint, right? They've either got a USB connection or an additional network cable that then connects to that infrastructure. And so they end up being these kind of large security risks that just they go mostly looked at, right? Because of that. So I want to pull one of those up here in the UI. So, inside of Phosphorus, right, we have the ability to go out and discover these things. In the wild, we have data center customers today where they've come to us with this use case specifically, where they said, hey, we've got a bunch of PDUs. We need to, first and foremost, know where they all are, right? And then we can start talking about understanding context and remediating those issues. But I think this is a good example right here of one of these PDUs. This is just a Raritan PDU. We see these. They're fairly ubiquitous. We see them kind of everywhere. And for us, being able to go in here and do discovery and find that IP address, find the MAC address, that's really cool. That's helpful that we can get that and be confident in that. But when we start looking at additional context is where I think things get really interesting. And so when we're looking at this example PDU here, this is a live device. This is actually in our labs in Nashville. But we can start to understand a little bit more about the device, not just the IP address and the MAC address, but what firmware version is it running? What are the power specifications of that device? Context that might not be a security concern, but maybe is an operational concern, right? Maybe the data center company needs to know that. But then we get into some, I think, really interesting things like, is SSH enabled or disabled on that device? Right, that's something that you probably want to know if you're running one of these devices in your environment. Is Telnet enabled or disabled, right? And so what we can actually do is not only see those settings, but we can alert on that and actually tell the end user through Phosphorus, that one of these devices is configured insecurely. And I think the power of being able to do that in real time as we detect those insecure configurations is really strong. And so if we click on this alert here, you can see this takes us to the alert screen. There's some historical alerts, but not only do we have an insecure device, but we also have out-of-date firmware, right? So you've talked, you kind of talked a little bit earlier about how these things can have vulnerabilities, CVEs associated with them. They're out of date. We also can talk about how they're insecurely configured. We can see here this version of firmware is actually fairly recent. This is September of 23, but even that recent of a firmware upgrade still has multiple newer versions that have come out since then. Now that's going to vary by vendors. Some vendors are going to come out with new firmware every month. They're going to try and be very proactive and patch these vulnerabilities as they're discovered. Other vendors might go a year or two between major firmware version releases. But the idea of being able to track that, understand it in your environment, and then do something about it. And I think that's where one of our superpowers is the fact that we're talking to these devices, we're talking to these PDUs, and helping organizations actually secure them. One additional use case I wanted to talk through here on the PDU is our ability to, because again, our superpower is talking to the device, we have this ability to understand more context than what kind of comes out of the box by default. And one of those things is actually looking at the certificates that are deployed to these devices. Now, we see this a lot where a device like an IoT device, a PDU or something similar is deployed. In a best case scenario, we see customers that know when they deploy it, they need to change the default credentials. That's great. That's really good security hygiene. Some of them even know to update to the latest version of firmware before they go out and actually deploy that. But rarely, if ever, do we see customers understand that kind of final step of, these things are shipped with SSL certificates installed by the manufacturer. They're self-signed certs, and they're not very secure. So if we actually go in here to the certificates tab, we can see the SSL cert that's deployed to this PDU. Now, in most cases, again, in the wild, this is going to be self-signed by the manufacturer. It'll likely be expired long after it was deployed. And it was something that the customer had no control over, right? So this isn't something that they were involved with. But it's not something that most organizations, even on the mature side of the scale, think about or have built into their processes for onboarding new devices. And so now with Phosphorus, not only can we identify that and discover that in the process, but we can allow our customers to at scale actually remediate that issue, create their own self-signed certificate via integration to a CA, and deploy that to that IoT infrastructure. And so now we've not only increased or decreased the risk with the passwords being changed, we've decreased the risk with having the latest version of firmware, but now we're also securing that communication channel to the device, so that as you're doing things and talking to the device, somebody can't eavesdrop on that channel. All right. And so that said, from a PDU standpoint, this is I think a kind of comprehensive look into what we could do with PDUs. But that can go and extend even further. We talked about cameras being deployed in data centers. That's obviously a huge physical security component. Most people have that kind of built into their mindset, but these things are also basically a Linux server just sitting in the environment, right? And so if you know the right way to interact with these things, even a default credential isn't necessarily, even changing that credential isn't necessarily enough, right? Because they've got vulnerabilities. You can see here, this was an Axis camera. We have these at virtually every one of our customers. If I were to click on this and go into the actual firmware version here, we could see all of the different versions of critical vulnerabilities that are associated with that specific version of the firmware. And so now you've got this camera, while it may not be running default credentials, it does have a vulnerability that if you just execute some simple commands or use a Metasploit, you can go in there and access that camera. And now you have a bastion on the network. Now you have a remote access point, right? Now the attacker can store a payload on that device. And then when the customer goes in and cleans out the network after a ransomware infection, the attacker can go back in and redeploy it from that camera, right? It's not that hard to do. It's just a Linux machine sitting under the hood. So all things that are great to be able to see, and most importantly through Phosphorus, you can actually go in here and fix those problems, like you can see here in the UI. So that's it. I think that's the end of my canned portion of the talk track. So I want to give it back to you there, Mike, if you have anything else you want to talk through before we go into Q&A.
Great. That's a great, like you said, canned view. Wasn't so canned. It was all very good. Yeah. So with like I said, one of the things that we like to do is at least to give a little bit of insight into some areas that actually impact all of us, even though we may not be completely in control from a security professional perspective of managing these types of devices. But it gives us, we like to say, and James likes to say, he's device obsessed, and everywhere he goes, he's always looking to see what's the device and how can it be compromised. And we hope to give you a little bit of that same kind of passion as well when you join us for this this session every other week.